1.
If you opened a web page today, logged into anything, or sent a message, you almost certainly used cryptography that our guest today invented. Daniel J. Bernstein, or DJB, wrote Curve 25519, Cha-Cha 20, ED 25519, QMail, DJB, DNS. He's also the guy who sued the U.S. government in the 1990s and got a court to rule that source code is free speech. And right now, he's in the middle of a fight most people will never see. A fight inside the standards body that runs the internet over whether the next generation of encryption keeps a backup layer or not. This is Hide and Speak, the weekly live stream series about privacy and free speech. I'm your host, Chris Miller, and I'm very excited for this episode, and I've been following Dan's work for over a decade. Dan, it is an absolute honor. Thank you so much for joining Hide and Speak.
Hi there, happy to be here. I should warn you that my internet connection has been a little flaky, so if things are going weird here, then I'm going to turn off the camera, but I'll try to keep the audio going.
But now you guys see proof. That's really him. And Nathan, my co-host, is here as well. How you doing today, Nathan?
Doing awesome this morning. Nathan, obviously creative media with vp.net and bmail, and extremely excited for this stream and to hear some of these stories today.
And me as well. And just a reminder that the opinions expressed by members of our panel are their own personal opinions and do not necessarily reflect the views of Hide and Speak, vp.net, bmail, or anybody else. If you have a question or for anyone on the panel, please ask it in the live chat on YouTube or X, starting with Q and colon, and we will respond to it during the Q&A session later in the stream. Before we get started, we do want to take a minute to thank vp.net and bmail, which make Hide and Speak possible. If you want to support the show, the best way to do that is to sign up for vp.net and bmail, which also happens to be a great way to protect your privacy online, and also happens to use encryption invented by our amazing guest. We got a quick video to watch, and then we're digging in. Imagine you want to contact your friend. You got to send them something in the mail, the normal snail mail, if anybody still uses that. So one option, which is like regular email, is just a postcard. So you send that, and anybody who sees this thing along the way, they know who you are, they know who the person who's receiving it is, they know what day and time you sent it, or at least when it was post-stamped, they know your address, and they know the content of the message, and they know the person's address. So they got everything. They got all the information they could possibly want. So the next option would be like some of these other encrypted email providers that don't encrypt the metadata, like Proton, for example. That's sort of like having a postcard where the message is invisible. Maybe that's in a secret code, so nobody along the way can see the message, but they can still see the sender, they still see the receiver, they see which city it was sent from, they see your address, they see the receiver's address. More than enough information in a lot of cases to figure out what's going on right there. And again, like the subject line, that's like on the, the front of it says like, greetings from Hawaii. It's like, okay, well, now this person's in Hawaii now. And that's kind of like having the subject line visible. So then bmail is like, you take a letter and you put it inside a safe and you seal that safe with a digital code and you ship the safe to the person, and he is the only other person in the entire world that knows what that code is. That's how bmail is. So anybody along the way, good luck. Like, you're not getting inside. This is a safe. That's kind of how bmail works. It's basically a vault, and the only people who have the code are you and the person that you're sending it to. All right, let's get going here. So a lot of people don't even realize this, but most people that are listening right now have used cryptography today without knowing it that you've invented. What are some widely used examples?
Probably the biggest one that is really protecting the connections that people are doing all the time is Curve 25519. So 25519, this is a name for a particular cryptographic system, which if you fire up your browser and you go to an HTTPS website, then it's using transport layer security, TLS. And inside that, it's deciding how do we scramble data so that eavesdroppers are not able to figure out what the data is, what your original, we say in cryptography, what your plain text is, the actual message you're sending, that gets scrambled into ciphertext, which is sent through the internet. And well, how is that scrambling done? There's various pieces of that, and the most common way that your browser does that is using Curve 25519, which is something that I introduced, well, I guess 20 years ago already.
Absolutely. That's the thing. Like, people don't even realize that, like, all day, every day, almost all of us were being protected by stuff that you invented. And to me, like, you're just an absolute legend, and I think that everybody deserves and should know who you are and know that the contributions you've made to us, because it's honestly, the world would be a very different place without DJB. So you've said encryption is a form of free expression. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so this was something where in my court case back in the 90s, this was actually something which courts had not looked at before, that what the government was doing back then was the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, they were trying to say, okay, if you want to use cryptography, then you're not allowed because there's export controls. Now, what does export controls have to do with cryptography? Well, export controls say you can't export arms outside the country. And then NSA said, well, we're going to define arms to include cryptography, and we're going to define export to include anything where you're giving cryptographic software to foreigners, which of course can also happen inside the country. And so just by playing games with words, they were able to say, oh yeah, this law is controlling any cryptographic software, unless they said if it's really weak cryptographic software that they can see through, then that's okay. And then that's something that everybody can use. And that was an exception to the export laws. But for everybody else, back in the 90s, they were saying, oh, you are not allowed to use strong cryptographic software. And then, okay, this lawsuit that I filed in the 90s was saying, come on, there's freedom of speech. And freedom of speech includes telling people, look, here's how you can protect yourself. That's speech. That's telling somebody, here's what you do to protect yourself, including here's the details of how you can scramble your messages. That's speech. And I mean, instructions, those are speech. And just because it's useful doesn't mean it's outside the First Amendment. But, well, courts hadn't looked at encryption before, and they hadn't really looked at software before. And so there was a bunch of arguments back and forth. And then the court was deciding, oh, yeah, actually, software is speech. And, I mean, software is just instructions that a computer can understand. At this point, I mean, computers can understand English, so at least somewhat, and kind of respond in English. And it would be kind of crazy for somebody to say, oh, the First Amendment has an exception, like no more freedom of speech if a computer can understand it. But, well, back in the 90s, that was maybe not something so obvious to courts. They had to figure it out. And so that in the court case, that was a major part of it. And then after that, the court was saying, well, okay, just because something's speech doesn't necessarily mean it's protected by the First Amendment. So the case went on from there. But that was one of the big parts of it, was saying, yeah, encryption software, that is speech.
Yeah, and it's so important that that precedent got set too. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were talking about that before the stream, like how different the internet would look, if developers weren't freely able to make and distribute code that, could do things like this using strong encryption. And, that's an interesting point you brought up. I hadn't really thought of it. Like, we live in an era where just plain English can develop advanced code because of AI. So, if what would that mean today if code wasn't, protected speech? Will, like, all English now no longer be protected speech because you could use any part of English to make code? You know what I mean? So that's a very interesting point. I hadn't considered that. In plain language, what is the fight that you're having inside the IETF right now?
Well, right now, NSA, they have this long-running program where they're weakening cryptography. So what they do, this is called the SIGINT Enabling Project. And this is a project where it was secret for many years, although people could see examples of it and say, wait a minute, this must be this huge NSA program. Finally, in 2013, the Snowden documents included the budget document, which was explaining what the SIGINT Enabling Project was doing. $250 million a year for sabotaging everybody's security. And this said, like, the top line in this SIGINT Enabling Project budget request was explaining that this project is covertly influencing or overtly leveraging commercial cryptography to make it exploitable by, well, NSA. While at the same time, I'm trying to remember what word they were using. It was something like the consumer and other adversaries. I think that's what they said. The consumer and other adversaries, well, from NSA's perspective, they're attackers. So the consumer and other adversaries think that the security is intact. And so they're trying to sabotage cryptography in a way that people keep using it, thinking that it's safe. And at the same time, it's not actually safe. It's something that NSA is able to break. They make some sort of changes to it so that they're able to break it. And then there were a bunch of specific budget items in this, including, for example, sabotaging cryptographic standards. And well, that's what we've seen happening before that already a number of times. And subsequently, NSA is involved in these standards organizations, either directly or through their, can I say, minions, I mean, they pay people to help out with what they want to do. And they show up to these standards organizations and they say, look, here's something that is good for you to do. Or maybe they're sort of secretly working behind the scenes. That would be the covert part. But the overt part is where they just show up to a standards organization and say, oh, we're the National Security Agency. We're trying to promote security. It's in our name. And look, why don't we standardize this? And that's what they're doing now. They're taking something which is strong and they are trying to replace it with something weaker. Now, I have to be careful when I say something strong. Cryptography is never absolute. Security is never absolute. And we try the best we can to minimize risks, unless, of course, you're NSA, and then you try to add new risks. And that's what they're doing here. They're taking something which is sensible, and then they're adding unnecessary risks to that. That's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very dangerous thing. And it's a great point that you make. I hear people all the time, they'll say, oh, no, this one is 100% foolproof. This can't be cracked. This can't be broken. And, you specifically have broken through many, many things in the past. So, I mean, firsthand that's never actually true. And that, like, it's just you do the best that you can. And to take something that is the best that we can do and purposely trim it back and make it less strong just doesn't make any sense unless, like you say, your goal is to be able to get through it. So.
Right. When it feels intentional, right? Like they are intentional
Sure.
in wanting people to use the weaker encryptions.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, so even coming down to like the messaging and the terminology they use, they use the term hybrid. And I've heard you say before, like you prefer to use the term double encryption, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So what's going on here is, first of all, context. There's quantum computers that are coming. I mean, we haven't seen one actually working yet. All the quantum computers that have been built so far, they're toys, they're science experiments. But it looks like they're on a path towards being real quantum computers. Like within not very many years, it looks like the public will be able to build a quantum computer that can actually do something useful. And there's all sorts of details, which I could get into, but the point is, it looks plausible. It's not demonstrated yet. And somebody who says, look, demonstrate it or else it's not real, I totally understand that. But it does look very plausible. Things are following the predictions for how the technology is improving. And so quantum computers are coming. My estimate for some years now has been that by 2029, there's going to be secret quantum attacks. By 2032, there's going to be public quantum attacks. The difference there is because, well, attackers have been doing this sooner and investing more money than the public. And then, well, you have to kind of estimate how much impact that has on how far ahead the attackers are. So, okay, there's this problem coming up. It's not like we're sure about the timeline at this point, but so far everything's been in line with these predictions. And then, all right, suppose the attacker has a quantum computer in 2029. What does that mean? It means that for, say, $1 billion for this quantum computer, and a big attacker, maybe they can even have several of those, and it's going to get cheaper gradually over time. For one of those quantum computers, they're going to be able to break thousands of elliptic curve keys, ECC keys, or thousands of RSA keys, depending on the exact size. I mean, thousands is sort of rough estimate from the latest papers, and it wouldn't be surprising if it's like 5 times more or 5 times less, but that's the rough ballpark. And so they're going to go after whatever their highest value targets are, whatever they're most interested in breaking. They're going to take those keys and apply their quantum computers to that, starting in, say, 2029, maybe 2028, maybe 2030, but whatever the timeline is, we've got a problem coming up, almost certainly. Again, hopefully the quantum computing project just totally fails. I would love to see it fail, because all of the benefits that people talk about of quantum computers improving our computations, right? No. The real effect of quantum computers is they're going to break all sorts of keys that we're relying on for security. Everything else is just this cover story to have investment in quantum computing. I mean, maybe they'll have some, like people talk about how quantum computers might improve fertilizer, for example, like have better chemistry to produce better fertilizer. But the real obvious impact of quantum computers is breaking security. And that's certainly a lot of investment. Now, all right, what do we do about this? Well, there's something, I coined the phrase post-quantum cryptography many years ago. And this is something where I've been putting a lot of work in, and hundreds and hundreds of people have been putting a lot of work into post-quantum crypto. And so what this is supposed to do is you're designing cryptographic systems which you try to make them resist quantum attacks. So you can use, based on the laws of physics, you can figure out what quantum computers will be able to do if they're built. And starting from that, you can say, okay, let's try to figure out what we can do with these quantum computers. And that's a question of designing attack algorithms. And then how can you design a cryptographic system which resists that? Which is the same sort of thing cryptographers have been doing for many years with, I would say, more and more success, or fewer and fewer failures before quantum computers come along. But then quantum computers, well, they expand what the attacker can do. And so we need new cryptographic systems which can protect against these quantum computers. Now, people have tried all sorts of ideas for building post-quantum crypto, which can hopefully protect against quantum computers. But half of the proposals have been broken by laptops. And it's really, I mean, just you're trying to protect against these big, powerful future computers, and you come up with a design that's supposed to be able to do that. And somebody says, hey, look, here's some software which breaks your system in 10 seconds on a laptop. It's kind of embarrassing for all of us in the cryptographic community. We're not able to get this. And so, okay, there's various proposals. There are some proposals that have held up for a few years, and there's ones that I like just because they've held up for more years. But there's a lot of newer proposals where they're supposed to be more efficient than the older proposals, et cetera. And okay, so there's these ideas for post-quantum crypto, which has survived at least a few years of scrutiny. And then, well, let's try encrypting everything with that and signing everything with that. Now, the big debate right now is not about whether we do that. Almost everybody's in agreement that, yeah, we should try to protect against quantum computers. A few people will say, they're not going to happen at all. Let's not bother. It's just a waste of time. We have better things to do. But the consensus of almost all the people who've been looking at this is we better do something just in case quantum computers come, even if we're not absolutely sure they're going to come. Let's protect against that. And then, all right, so let's roll out some post-quantum crypto. But what happens if what we're rolling out turns out to be something else breakable? Or what happens if the software for it turns out to be something where people screw up? And that happens all the time. Now, the funny thing is, in a post-quantum crypto system, you're typically sending like a kilobyte or more of data, which is not very much data. But compared to the old stuff, compared to elliptic curve crypto, it's much bigger. Elliptic curves, you're typically sending 32 bytes. And that's nothing compared to a kilobyte or more of data. And so a really obvious thing to do is just for signing, for example, you send along a kilobyte or 2 kilobytes of a signature with this post-quantum system, which hopefully is adding protection against quantum computers. And then you also, just in case something goes wrong, to not have a complete disaster, you just add another 32, 64 bytes to keep signing with some elliptic curve system. And then, so you sign with both. And of course, the receiver checks both of those signatures. So that the attacker has to forge a message, which is having a signature under the old system and the new system. And then, okay, that's the common sense thing to do. And that's what has happened for most of the deployments so far of post-quantum crypto until NSA started trying to screw that up. And that's where we are now.
Well, and what do they say? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of. I'm glad that you broke down the actual size of these things, because that's, I hear the performance. People talk about the performance hit from using both forms at the same time, but when one is 32 bytes, when you're already using one that's a kilobyte, adding 32 bytes is really, that's nothing. Like, it's not even noticeable. So it's just sort of disingenuous to talk about the extra bandwidth used and the performance hit. Let's see, walk us through the seatbelt. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, walk us through the seatbelt analogy that you've used before.
Yeah, it's like, look, suppose that you've got a new car, and I mean, the people who are designing the car, of course, they try very hard to make sure the car doesn't crash. I mean, that's something where it's one of the most important features of a car, that it's not going to just suddenly crash. I mean, maybe for Tesla it might be a little bit different, that's not their highest priority, but it's for most car manufacturers. They want to make sure that your car is safe. And then, well, sometimes, despite all those efforts to make sure your car doesn't crash, sometimes the car loses, control of the brakes, or, driver makes a mistake, or, suddenly something comes out from the side of the road, and, sometimes there's a crash. And then what do you do in that situation? Well, I mean, it's a problem. Obviously, you're not happy if your car is crashing, but you're still trying to reduce the damage. And so that's what prompted the introduction of seatbelts many years ago, was saying, all right, if the car crashes, let's at least, try not to kill people. And so a seatbelt is going to reduce the damage. Airbags also is another example. You're trying to put something in which is, look, it's not as good as the car not crashing, but in case the car crashes, which does often happen, there's still something like 10,000 people a year killed by car crashes. And it's really, you're trying to reduce that. It's slowly getting better, but it's something where all the safety mechanisms that you put in, you still, you don't hold back on one safety mechanism just because you're trying to get another safety mechanism right. So, okay, the analogy is a car crash is your post-quantum system is something which you try to make sure it's secure, but actually it ends up being breakable because of some problem with the specification or some problem with the software. So, there could be bugs in the software or timing attacks. You have some leak of secret information. This has happened a bunch of times. And then something goes wrong with the post-quantum part, but because you're still signing or encrypting with your elliptic curve system really cheaply, that's something where you still have some protection. Now, again, the attacker is going to come along with a quantum computer in a few years, and they're going to be breaking thousands of elliptic curve keys. And that's terrible. But it's much worse if we don't have that protection, and then one bug is suddenly meaning that millions of keys are exposed. So we have both of these things in place. The seatbelt is continuing to use your existing cryptography, for instance, elliptic curves. And then you're at the same time trying to make sure the car doesn't crash, and that is putting in your post-quantum system to try to protect against quantum computers.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
I hadn't heard that one before. I think that's a really great analogy too, because I hear so many people often say, "Oh, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't have anything to hide." So they say, "Oh, well, I don't need a seatbelt, right? Or I don't need any encryption because whatever." But I think it's important to enforce that, at least having a little bit of something is better than nothing. And to just give up completely on encryption is silly. It might not be perfect now, but we should be ever pursuing this to make it better and better and better, rather than just giving up.
Sure. Carrying on with the seatbelt analogy, what I love about that too is, the complexity of trying to make a vehicle not crash is very difficult, complex, expensive, whereas the complexity and the expense of adding a seatbelt is very, very small comparatively. And that lines up very well with this example here. Adding the seatbelt is very cheap. Why not do that? But no, that makes a lot of sense. Supporters say the new algorithm is not known to be weak. What is wrong with that reasoning?
There's a lot to be said for that. I mean, if somebody comes along with an algorithm that is known to be weak, definitely don't want to be using that. So at least there's this baseline of throw away the things that have been broken. And again, that's like half of the proposals so far are proposals that have been broken publicly, and we definitely don't want to be using those. So if somebody can't get past that filter, then I totally agree. We don't want to be using the broken algorithms. But the question is whether that means it's okay to also throw away the protection that we have from the existing cryptography, which compared to the post-quantum systems, as you were saying, it's really cheap. I mean, to give you some numbers that just pop into my head, with the smallest signature system that I've seen people rolling out now, it's 2,420 bytes. Maybe don't quote me on that, but that's what pops into my head for a signature versus 64 bytes for a typical elliptic curve signature. And it's so cheap to add that elliptic curve signature on top. Why not do it? And encryption, what pops into my head is 1,088 bytes for what's typically being done for post-quantum encryption versus 32 bytes for your elliptic curve system. It's such this tiny extra bit to add on. If there were a higher cost adding the old stuff, keeping the old stuff, then I could understand a question of trade-offs, like, okay, can we actually afford it? And then it starts getting complicated. But when the ratio is such a tiny cost for the keeping what we're doing now and just making sure we're continuing to do that while we sign or encrypt with the new stuff, then it's just a no-brainer. Just obviously do that. And
For sure.
Yeah, that's the situation.
Yeah, I mean, if the numbers were reversed, if the elliptic curve was 32 bytes, and you know I'm sorry, if the post quantum was 32 bytes, and adding the elliptic curve meant adding another kilobyte, you might have an argument there. But when it's adding the 32 bytes, is like, and we're in a world, you load a web page now and it's 20 megabytes downloading in like 5 seconds. You know what I mean? So
Right.
it's like, what is 32 bytes really going to do? It's other than keep us extra safe, you know? It's just sort of silly. And, you know, like to the argument that, well, you know, if they're able to crack through post quantum, then they're probably going to be able to crack through the elliptic curve. Like, well, you know, sometimes seatbelts don't work. Does that mean we should never use seatbelts? You know what I mean? Like the argument that sometimes it might not work, like that doesn't make any sense. Like, it's because that also means sometimes it will work, you know, and I prefer to have the extra layer personally.
Yeah,
So,
a lot
and
of what I'm
actually-
doing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you go, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just saying. So a lot of what I'm doing, I mean, in working on cryptography, I mean, I'm sometimes looking at like mathematical attacks against things or designing crypto systems, but a ton of what I'm doing is looking at the software layer. Like, what does it look like to actually integrate cryptographic systems into applications, and what do we need to do to actually make that cryptography secure, and what goes wrong? And that's something where we've seen so many failures, even for post-quantum systems, which look like they're okay against mathematical attacks, at least as far as we know. For example, Kyber, also known as MLChem, and dilithium, also known as MLDSA. These are systems which nobody has publicly broken. The security levels against the best attacks known, they're maybe dropping somewhat every few months, but it's still way beyond attacks that we can do. And okay, does that mean they're okay? Well, I look at software and I say, no, it is not okay. For example, Kyber/2, Clangover. These are attacks which were breaking MLChem software by exploiting timing variations to figure out secrets from that software. Another example, MLDSA. We've seen a bunch of CVEs for MLDSA software. I wouldn't say that most of them are severe, but we've seen some bugs in dilithium software which allow exploits. I actually just put up an exploit demo in a paper this month, which is saying, all right, here's how you can, in 1 second, less than 1 second on one laptop core, here's how you can exploit one of these bugs in order to recover an equivalent secret key for dilithium, MLDSA. So here's how you can, if somebody is having software with this bug, and again, real bug that actually happened, if someone has software with that bug, then here's how an attacker can look at a couple of signatures and then start forging signatures, faking messages, faking signatures under your public key. And this is something which, again, one bug, this is going to affect millions of people. And that's something where just saying, oh, these cryptographic systems have survived some mathematical scrutiny of the specifications, that's good. It's a nice starting point, but the real world of software gets a lot more complicated and has a lot more security problems than just what people are looking at in these specifications. And that's the unhappy world that I'm living in and trying to improve. And that's where it's just crazy to throw away the protections that we have.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You know, I see we just got a question. Usually we save these for later, but it seems particularly relevant. So I'm going to pull it up now. Why do you think we received so much pushback at the state level when trying to get end-to-end encryption defined in statute?
I wonder if it's still possible to get from the questioner which statute we're talking about. So I'm trying to match this up. I mean, of course, there are a lot of examples of debates about end-to-end encryption, but
he's in Oregon. I think it just means in general, you know, when trying to get push for end-to-end encryption to be defined in general in law, it seems to be a lot of pushback on that.
I mean, sometimes, so political debates about encryption tend to be, for example, if you have somebody like NSA, obviously they want encryption to be weak. But also, if you look at, say, you have a police agency which is trying to, what they're paid to do is, well, solve crimes. They're not actually paid to stop crimes. They're paid to solve crimes. So if crimes happen, then what has the police saying, oh, yeah, we've done a good job, is saying, oh, yeah, we figured out who did it and we got a prosecution. And that's what gets most of the people. I mean, of course, there are some police who try to, you know, walk around and make sure nothing bad is happening. But most of the money for police departments comes from trying to figure out what went wrong when a crime happened. And sometimes they will run into, oh, somebody has a phone where they've got some data on that phone, which we think could actually solve some crime if we could get into the phone. And then the police will complain, hey, we're not able to get into this phone. And encryption is one part of that if you don't have encryption, then, well, the police are keeping records of all the communications they can, just like NSA is. And then if there's no encryption, then it does make the job of the police easier in looking at what everybody's doing and figuring out what everybody's doing. And so that's where the debates that I see typically come from is you have people who are paid to try to figure out everything that's happening, whether it's NSA that officially is spying on all foreigners and unofficially is spying on, well, the whole world, including Americans. And then you have, say, police where they're paid to try to solve crimes primarily, and they want to understand what happened because that's their job. And they want to, look around and see everything happening. I mean, spies, snoops, eavesdroppers, detectives. It's the same kind of job, trying to look around the Stasi in East Germany. It's whatever you think about the different kinds of people doing this. That's the incentives are. They would like to understand what everybody else is doing. And then they are naturally opposed to encryption. Whereas somehow everybody else likes encryption. And then you end up with this big debate because some people want to spy on everybody and, well, everybody else doesn't want to be spied on. That's where the basic debates that I see are coming from.
For sure. Yeah. So he followed up too. He was actually wondering, and specifically, in Oregon, there's a Senate Bill 1516, which is about the automatic license plate readers, well, like flock cameras and things like that. And they had messaging in there originally trying to define end-to-end encryption and put actual definitions on it. And privacy advocates have alleged that the tech lobbyists had influenced them to remove the end-to-end encryption definitions, basically potentially like leaving loopholes in there.
Yeah, so I heard just a little bit about this, and I'm not familiar enough with it to really comment. But yeah, this is a sort of debate that happens all the time because you got these people with different incentives regarding encryption.
Yeah, honestly, it sounds very similar to what you're saying. Like the more, if it's encrypted, then that means only the people who are supposed to have access get access. And as we keep seeing, other agencies seem to end up with access to it. And if everything's fully encrypted, that's going to make that a lot more difficult for them. So I think it's basically the same thing that you're saying, just in a different platform, So going back to the whole encryption debate here, like there's actually a case that sort of shows what happens when you remove the old layer, which was the issue of Psych. Can you walk us through what happened there?
Yeah, so I mean, Psych was an awesome cryptographic system. It stands for something like super singular isogeny key exchange, which, I mean, there's some mathematical definition, but already if the name of a cryptographic system starts super, then already you're feeling like, wow, cool. I'd like to have a crypto system called Super. I should have had like Super Curve 25519 instead of just Curve 25519. I tend to go for these boring names with like numbers and stuff, but no, if you can say super singular, which again, it does have a mathematical meaning. So anyway, this cryptographic system, it was introduced in 2011. To be precise, it was something called super singular isogeny Diffie-Hellman. So this was a mechanism of taking from the 1970s, the original public key crypto system was from Diffie and Hellman. And this super singular isogeny version of it was using some fancy math stuff, isogenies related to elliptic curves, but fancier than just using basic elliptic curves. And this was saying we can use that to do some form of Diffie-Hellman, which should resist quantum computers. Now, it had some sort of usability problems in the original version, which were fixed by Psych. So SIKE, super singular isogeny key exchange. This was starting from SIDH and then kind of wrapping some stuff around it to make it usable. And that was a submission to the NIST competition in 2017. NIST called in 2016 for within a year, by the end of 2017, please submit proposals for post-quantum crypto systems, and they will figure out what they would like to standardize. And then Psych was one of those submissions. And again, the idea started in 2011. and more support built up for it, more and more people joining the psych team. They got academics from around the world. They got Microsoft and various other companies putting a lot of effort into it. Microsoft even started offering cash rewards like $50K for being able to break some toy psych instances, scaled down versions of psych, like that you can't break this tiny version of psych. And all right, then more and more, there was a paper called The Case for Psych, which was saying how it survived. This was in 2021. It was saying how it had survived for 10 years. Okay, SIDH for 10 years, and psych was like the wrapper around it to make it usable. And then that survived for 10 years with no security loss. And there were a bunch of people saying, yeah, this sounds great. And it's not just that it has security holding up for 10 years, which is more than most post-quantum proposals. It's something where it was small. Now, it's not, depending on exactly how you look at it, it's maybe not quite as small as some other possibilities, but it is one of the overall smallest post-quantum systems, like 300 something bytes instead of a kilobyte, which, okay, most applications, if you're sending megabytes, gigabytes of data, you don't care about a kilobyte here. But maybe you have an application which is sending lots of little pieces of data, and each one needs to be separately encrypted. And maybe you notice if you're adding a kilobyte to each of those, and it's 3 times cheaper if you're only adding 300 bytes to each of those instead of a kilobyte. And so, okay, psych was cool performance. It was maybe a bit slow on the computational side. Most post-quantum crypto systems, the major cost is the communication, and the computation happens much faster than the communication. Psych, it was kind of the other way around because of some complications in doing isogeny computation. So psych ended up being kind of slow, which somewhat offset the advantage of the small objects being communicated, the public key and the ciphertext in psych. But okay, it still attracted a lot of attention. It got rolled out as part of a big experiment from Google and Cloudflare. This was in 2019. Got rolled out, applied to tens of millions of connections. So users were switching over from any users of Chrome Canary had some percentage chance of using psych for their connections. And then Google was collecting data from those connections to see how well it was performing on real network environments. And then they announced the results of that, and Cloudflare collecting this data. And they tried just 2 options. Psych was one of those options, and something based on Entru, another post-quantum system, that was another option. And so psych, it had a lot of momentum, a lot of praise for it. It had deployment being applied to real connections. And then in 2022, there were 2 papers at the same time from some academics saying, here's how to break SIDH and psych just super fast. Well, okay, the original papers is maybe an hour or so to break psych, but that got rapidly sped up to the point of seconds to break psych, even at the highest security level, which was above where it had been rolled out. And that was, what I remember is 11 seconds for the latest paper on here's how fast you can break the highest security level for psych. And that's really, again, this sort of thing is really embarrassing for the cryptographic community. The only thing that went right is that when Google and Cloudflare did this experiment with rolling out these post-quantum systems for real connections, they also, of course, kept an elliptic curve layer. So they were encrypting things with psych and with elliptic curves. And they said explicitly, just in case something goes wrong with this post-quantum thing, let's make sure to keep the elliptic curve thing in place. Which, I mean, even compared to psych having only, say, 300 bytes, 32 bytes for elliptic curves is just not a big deal. And so, okay, they did both of those. And that thankfully meant that when psych got publicly broken, then attackers who were recording all of those psych ciphertexts were still faced with the problem of breaking the elliptic curve part. And also, I think it's important to emphasize the attackers are often going to be ahead of the public. There's the attacks that we know publicly, but attackers who are investing millions or billions in coming up with attacks, they are going to know a lot of attacks that we don't know in public. They know all the public attacks, plus whatever they've been investing in breaking. And so the attackers could easily have known the psych attack much earlier. And anyway, certainly they knew it by 2022. And then, I mean, at that point, NIST, a few weeks before these papers came out, NIST, in their post-quantum competition for standardization, they had again selected psych as one of just a few possibilities under consideration for standardization. And they were saying that it looked like it was more attractive than some other options that they were considering. And then a few weeks later, it's totally smashed. So it's just an amazing example of how cryptographers can really screw things up. But thankfully, do one thing right, which is doing, well, in this case, double encryption, or for signatures, same kind of thing, doing double signatures. That's what saved the day. It's still, again, it's not that we're happy with the elliptic curve situation, because it looks like quantum computers are coming, but throwing away the elliptic curves makes the situation even worse. And thankfully for Psych, it was Psych plus elliptic curves.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what's crazy, is like we've seen a real world example of why it's important to have that at the seatbelt there, and to turn away from that just doesn't make any sense. See, I got some great questions rolling in here from people. Let's see. What can we, the people, do to fight the NSA's infiltration of the IETF and IAESG?
You know, that is a fascinating question. I think the infiltration per se is really, really hard to deal with, because the problem is, even if you kick NSA out of the room, which has often been proposed, they're just going to hire people to go to the room and do what they want to do. And so how do you tell who it is who's working for NSA? If you punish the people who are publicly working for NSA, they just go silent and they're doing it covertly. And so it's really, really tough to get rid of the infiltration. But you can still outvote them. So this is actually what happened just a few months ago. So there are a few different specifications of cryptography, post-quantum crypto, with and without seatbelts. And there's a big fight right now about what to do about those. And well, the most recent vote regarding encryption without seatbelts, there were 21 people who were speaking up in favor of encryption without seatbelts. And there were 22 people who spoke up against encryption without seatbelts. Now, just to be clear about what the standard is supposed to be for how you set standards, IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, like other standards organizations, says that it issues consensus standards, standards that have consensus of all interested parties. It's not supposed to be majority vote. It's not supposed to be like a political process of, can you convince 51% of the people to vote for something? But okay, if 51% are voting against, that is definitely not consensus. And so that actually stopped the solo ML-chem, so that's encryption without seatbelts, that's encryption with only ML-chem, only Kyber, and not using elliptic curves. It stopped that proposal for a few months. Unfortunately, like any good zombie movie, it keeps coming back. Now, funny thing, like, take another movie analogy for a moment here. You know how in the movies, the villain is sometimes going to be declaring their plans, like they're confidently saying how, I'm going to do the following. And now, you know that behind the scenes, they've got their secret. Here's why they're confident. And maybe they come out with a secret at some point and explain it when they think it's too late for anybody to do anything. And okay, what happened just a few days ago was I think I can say, corrupt people who are running this show inside IETF. They said, all right, we're going to have another vote. We're going to vote and see, is everybody okay with this just using ML-chem without seatbelts? And again, there's also a document which is saying ML-chem with seatbelts. And that's also something which is widely used. It is the common thing to do. How post-quantum crypto is rolled out right now is with seatbelts, with elliptic curves, also protecting you just in case something goes wrong with the post-quantum part. And nevertheless, the chairs of the IETF Transport Layer Security TLS Working Group said, all right, let's have another vote. Yeah, they never actually admitted that they only had a minority last time, and that 20 people were saying, hey, security problems here, don't do this. This is stupid. They never admitted that. They said, well, all sorts of things have changed. Like now we've got, I don't know, there have been some news about quantum computers, or I don't know, everybody's more worried about something, or whatever stupid excuses they have. They say, we're going to now run another vote. And now here's the movie villain part. They said, if this vote shows that there is rough consensus, then we will progress this document. But if it does not, then this document is dead. We will never do anything with it again. Maybe in slightly less movie-like language, but that's what they said. And now okay, what is the villain thinking at that point? Well, clearly what's happening is they're planning to pack the vote. So they're planning to call all the people they know who could possibly show up to this IETF TLS working group and say, yep, we are voting for throwing away seatbelts. We're voting for doing something that's damaging security. So we've already seen in just a few days since this was announced, people like, for example, somebody named Mike Jenkins from the US National Security Agency. And this is somebody who has never posted anything to the IETF TLS mailing list before. I've been on the mailing list since the 90s, and I went through my archives, and his name has never appeared on the from line of any message to the IETF TLS working group mailing list. And well, except now he's shown up to say that he supports moving this document forward. And well, he's not the only one. This is, I mean, it's clearly behind the scenes. What happened was calling all their friends and saying, all right, look, you want some federal contracts controlled by NSA in the future, you should send somebody to this IETF TLS working group and make sure that they vote for this document. Thing is,
Crazy.
The rules actually allow this. So the rules say it's not like there's a membership in IETF. It's not like IETF says you have to be sort of pre-registered and there's some rules for who's allowed to be there and some balance of interest. It is anybody can show up. So IETF rules say if NSA or anybody else as an individual, officially it's all individuals, it's not like organizations, companies, whatever. It's just individuals can join the IETF mailing list and participate in IETF and obviously cast votes for various documents or votes against various documents. So somebody was asking what we can do about this infiltration. I just set up a web page. I didn't actually set up the redirect yet from HTTP to HTTPS. And you should always type HTTPS anyway, because otherwise there's an initial moment where if you're doing HTTP and your browser's not doing HTTPS by default, then the attacker can sneak into the connection at that moment. Anyway, I should do a redirect. But what I'm trying to say is there's a URL, which is https://action.cr.yp.to. And this just has a few paragraphs which are saying, all right, here's the situation and some links so you can read more. And then here's how you can join the mailing list and then say what you think about this document. And so this is, I mean, I hope that it fires up. I didn't actually test the web page. And so there's, I see a URL on my screen. So that's, if you go to action.cr.yp.to, it redirects you to, yes, nsa.2026.action.cr.yp.to. I was actually thinking, I actually own yp.to. I was thinking of using that as a link shortener to just do like yp.to redirecting. But anyway, action.cr.yp.to will show you, here's the situation. And I mean, please read up on it. And please, if you're going to join this mailing list and say something, then I mean, people who've been objecting have said things, just one line. The TLS chairs have said, please don't discuss this, just say whether you support things. And so people who object have said things like I do not support publication of this document, or similar wording like that. And if there are enough of those people speaking up, like again, the last time it was 22 people who were speaking up and saying this is a bad idea. And then, I mean, there really shouldn't be never-ending votes on this. It's like, imagine you have a sports event and then, you know, like one team wins and then the referees say, oh, the scoreboard had a malfunction. We're going to have to play the game again. And then it happens again. You play the game again, and then, oops, the same team wins. And then the referees say, oh, we're going to have to play the game again. I mean, at some point, you know what's going on here. And okay, it shouldn't be that there's one vote after another in this process. But okay, there is another vote now. And the villains are saying this is going to be the last vote. They're going to win this one. They probably lined up 50 people this time. But, you know, if we're an informed democracy, they would be losing by like 8 billion votes to NSA. That would be the situation. So I'm confident that having enough awareness of what's going on, this is something where, I mean, what they're doing here is really against the public interest. And they should not be able to just run one vote after another. And, well, this time, if enough people speak up, then first of all, it should be very clear there's not consensus on this. And secondly, If they don't have a majority of the people speaking up, then they're definitely not going to go ahead with this document. So I think there's a lot of value in doing something now.
Absolutely. So this is the moment, people, like, if you're wondering when should you get involved, like, this is when you should get involved. Like, this is a decision that will affect everything that we're doing online in the future. You know what I mean? This could go two different ways that will have drastically different outcomes here. So this is the moment to absolutely get involved and, check that link, and this is it. It's time to do something here. Let's see. What is CNSA 2.0, and what does it say about hybrids?
That's a fascinating question. So what it stands for, NSA has their documents which are saying what sort of cryptography they approve. Now, I should be clear. There's two types of these documents. Used to be called Suite A and Suite B. Those were the two documents. Suite A is their public documents for what they are trying to promote publicly for everybody to be using. Suite B is what they're using for the data they actually care about. And those documents are not public. There are some leaks which are saying some things about what's in Suite B, but they have their cryptography for the masses, what NSA wants everybody to be using, that's Suite A, and they have their actually cryptography when they really want security, that's Suite B. Now, the new version of Suite A is called CNSA. And well, CNSA 2.0 includes post-quantum crypto. And this is something where NSA had this funny announcement in 2015. Like in public, we've been working on post-quantum crypto for many, many years. First conferences in was it 2006 was the first conference on post-quantum crypto, and then more conferences after that, and lots of papers and trying to get software put out and making recommendations for what to do. And okay, 2015, suddenly NSA shows up with this announcement, like NSA recognizes that there's going to be a move to post-quantum cryptography at some point, and we're trying to figure out what to do about this. And then like the next day, they put out some revised press release saying something like, NSA is going to take the lead in doing post-quantum cryptography. Sorry about that initial press release. Anyway, so they jumped in publicly into saying stuff about post-quantum crypto about 10 years ago. And then since then, they've been issuing some documents which say, oh yeah, here's what we want people to be doing. And they actually, it's not just NSA saying, oh, this is for your own good, like in case you're interested, we're people who know something about security and trust us. NSA officially has control over the cryptographic part of US military purchasing. So anything which is sold to the US military that has some cryptographic component to it has to follow NSA's rules for how that cryptography works, which now means CNSA 2.0. Which includes some post-quantum crypto. And what does that say about hybrids? Well, what it actually says is hybrids, so like double signatures, double encryption, hybrids may be allowed for interoperability or standardization reasons. That's what the official CNSA 2.0 document says. Okay, sounds good. So if we have standards that say you have to do hybrids, you have to do double encryption, have to do double signatures, then okay. I mean, NSA is officially saying that that's one of the reasons to allow hybrids. Unfortunately, at some point, just a few years ago, Cisco showed up to the IETF TLS working group saying, NSA says that what they're willing to buy is only solo post-quantum crypto, non-hybrid. So throwing away the elliptic curve part. And so that's what Cisco is going to implement. And we want the TLS working group to be approving that. Now, I looked at this and said, wait, what? Where is this coming from? And well, eventually, some NSA employees were publicly saying, yeah, we've asked our vendors to not do double encryption, not do double signatures. And if any vendor is complying with that, that's the one we're going to purchase from. And so NSA is waving around this huge amount of money. I mean, I mentioned before the $250 million for the SIGINT enabling project, which is trying to sabotage cryptography. That's just NSA's direct budget for sabotaging crypto. But they also, because they control the cryptographic part of the US military budget, that has this huge impact on what companies are doing. And so if NSA even drops a hint that they want something happening for federal contractors, then it's going to be what the federal contractors do. And so CNSA 2.0, officially, NSA is not responsible for this. There is no, as far as I can tell, no official NSA statement which is saying, yeah, we are demanding that people throw away elliptic curves and just put everything on these new systems and hope everything works out okay. In fact, there's even other official NSA programs which say, in case of problems with a cryptographic implementation, we would like to purchase multiple layers of cryptography, which is exactly what I'm recommending. And it's the normal common sense thing to do. But, well, at the same time, there are individual NSA employees who are obviously putting a lot of pressure on companies, and there are companies that are complying with that and that are trying to get this stuff standardized. And so NSA is, without taking responsibility for it, but again, this is all, it's publicly documented that NSA employees are pressuring their vendors. Yeah, I see a comment on the screen saying hybrid for me, solo for thee. Yeah. NSA is pressuring their vendors to, well, normalize non-hybrid post-quantum crypto, solo post-quantum crypto. And for themselves, yeah, of course, what they're going to be doing for themselves for the data they actually care about is doing multiple encryption, multiple signatures. And so just in case something goes wrong with one layer, they're going to be protected because, I mean, they're not stupid. They're actually trying to protect some of their own data. But for everybody else, they're pressuring everybody else to, well, normalize and then entrench non-hybrid post-quantum crypto. And this is just going to do a ton of damage. Again, millions of keys are going to be broken just because of software bugs. And never mind the risk of more serious breaks of the entire specifications, which we've seen happening again and again for lots of post-quantum systems. I mean, software bugs is a definite problem. And this is really scary.
Yeah, you know, like this, and with most things with the government, don't listen to what they say, look at what they do, you know, and because here we have the NSA is saying, you know, they don't want us to use the double encryption, but you look and that's what they're using for their, like you say, for the data that they think is actually important. That's what they want to use. So that to me is much more revealing about what you should do as well. You know, if they need that for their own security, then we should have that as well. So it's just wild that they're pushing for the opposite of that. So how does one big buyer end up steering a standard the whole world uses? You know, I mean, it's just a wild situation. That are there other large buyers besides the NSA that are doing this as well?
That's a good question. I mean, in general, this kind of leverage, it's really hard to compete with something like U.S. defense contracting. And this was it Eisenhower warning about the U.S. military industrial complex gaining power? I mean, this is a really big thing that we're talking about. But look, there are other power players which are trying to do things. I mean, China, for example, they have regulations for what cryptography should look like in China. And as a result of that, phones, like any smartphone, is going to be supporting a Chinese algorithm simply because China said, yeah, we want everybody using this. And you're not going to be able to sell phones in China unless you're supporting these algorithms. And this is something where if you're a big enough player, then you can kind of get away with this, where this is definitely not how it should be working. I mean, if you look at IETF, again, this Internet Engineering Task Force that right now is being bought out by NSA, if you look at what they advertise and what they do, they say they have consensus standards where fundamentally IETF participants are using their best engineering judgment to come up with the best solution for the entire internet, not just some isolated part of the internet, one particular vendor. They're looking at the best solution, coming up with the best solution for everybody. And I mean, it sounds great, but it's just fictional. This is not, in fact, how IETF is working. You can have any number. Microsoft gets away with all sorts of things. Google gets away with all sorts of things. Various big governments get away with all sorts of things. Europe has a lot of people in it, but they're not really well enough organized to be able to put this kind of pressure on IETF. But there are any number of players that are big enough and organized enough to put this kind of pressure on IETF and other standards organizations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This kind of I've heard you say before that this reminds you of the weakening of DES back in the 70s. Can you kind of draw that parallel for us?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So this was something, it was the first cryptographic standard, at least in the US, but I think internationally, this was the first time, like computers were just starting to get popular in the 1960s, businesses buying computers and using them for more and more things. And while the US, at the time, it was the National Bureau of Standards before they changed name to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And while this NIST, NBS at the time, they said, you know, we're actually using a lot of computers in the federal government. Clearly, there's going to be more. And what are we doing about security of these things? We should figure something out. But we're NIST, we're NBS. We don't know anything about security. So who do we talk to get some advice? Well, we talk to NSA. They know something about security, right? Encryption. And so they contacted, this was like late 60s, early 70s, they contacted NSA. And NSA, according to documents that were revealed much later, NSA had this huge internal debate about what to do about standardization. Because it's much simpler if you don't have a standard that's what everybody's using. Then you can just have, like, NSA is going to try to make sure that they can break what everybody else is doing. And for the data they care about for themselves, they're going to have something that they believe is secure. And if you got that split, then NSA can be happy with that. But suppose you have a standard, which is what everybody is using, then, well, how do you reconcile having that being weak for NSA being able to break it versus, well, having something that's supposed to be strong, so say the Russians can't break it? And so NSA had this big debate, and eventually they decided that it was more important to be involved in the standardization process and have some sort of standard, which would be, well, they tried to split the difference as follows. They said they wanted something which would be weak enough for them to break. That was their phrasing, weak enough. And at the same time, something which was not obviously super breakable. So what they were imagining was that they could stay ahead of the Soviets, and they could have something which is weak enough for them to break, but hopefully strong enough for the Soviets not to break. And so they worked with NBS, later NIST, and they worked with IBM, which designed the data encryption standard, DES. And they figured out, all right, here's a size of key which we're comfortable with. Originally, IBM was actually proposing a 128-bit key, which is still not easy to break. It's like Bitcoin is doing 2 to the 111, 2 to the 112 bit operations per year, which can break something like a 95-bit key, depending on your exact crypto system. It's still, in Bitcoin, I mean, even if you have billions of dollars and you can do more computations than Bitcoin for carrying out attacks, this is something where you still can't really get to 128-bit keys. And IBM was originally proposing a 128-bit key. And then after more discussion with NSA, they weakened it to 64 and then eventually 56. And that's where the data encryption standard ended up, was a 56-bit key. And that was something where NSA, it was weak enough for NSA to break. And then eventually, 20 years later, like kids in a garage were able to break it, but it took a while before those public demos. And in the meantime, they were able to get this standardized and claim, oh, yeah, it's really strong, and this is going to be providing solid security. And we're only approving it for a few years. We're going to review the standard in 5 years. We just want something for right now. And they tried pulling out, actually, a lot of the same arguments that you see now. For instance, NSA said, we are going to use this data encryption standard. If we thought it was weak, why would we be using it? Well, maybe because they weren't actually using it, or maybe they were using it. You know, there's actually a pretty safe way to use DES, the data encryption standard, which is what's called triple DES, or even beyond that, quintuple DES, which means that you do multiple layers of the data encryption standard. And that actually significantly strengthens it. It's not quite as strong as you might think at first, but it's pretty good. It's still not easy to break triple DES today. And so, okay, if they were thinking internally, yeah, we can use triple DES, then that would actually make it true that they were saying, yeah, we're going to use triple DES. Just like now, they would say, oh, yeah, we're going to use MLChem and something else layered on top because they're not stupid. But they don't mention that that's what they're doing internally. What they say is, look, you should trust this thing that we're using, even though quietly they're actually using more than that because they want to protect themselves. And so in the case of the data encryption standard, they were saying this. I mean, the director of the US National Security Agency was saying, we are using the data encryption standard. And that's something which, I mean, this should show how confident we are in its security. But I mean, at this point, we know that it was breakable for them with their resources when that standard was made in the 1970s. So it's crazy how gullible people are. And when the Carter administration came in, they actually were objecting a lot to having a spy agency be in control of computer security for like normal people. And NSA was complaining about this. Like, wait, we want to be in charge of everybody's computer security so that we can have things be weak enough for us to break. And anyway, I find it really informative to look back at these historical examples, because it's very clear what the low security level was of the data encryption standard. We have enough information now from releases of internal NSA documents to know what NSA was thinking, so we can see the whole sabotage process from the beginning, what their thought process was, how they decided to sabotage this, how they decided to lie to the public about the security level of it. It makes perfect sense. This is what attackers do, and we saw it happening for the data encryption standard. Again, that was the first cryptographic standard. And for me, it's really informative looking at that and seeing, okay, what would I do as an attacker now? And of course, I learned from things that have worked in the past, like the data encryption standard. I learned from how gullible people can be, and NSA is pulling the same tricks today.
Yeah, it's pretty telling when you see, like you say, that's the first one, and that's also the first example of the NSA trying to trick the world into using a weaker standard. So I mean, it makes sense that they're still up to the same thing, just maybe doing it in different ways. And unfortunately, they're currently working on changing the rules on the IETF list to make it even easier for them to manipulate things. So, which is something we're going to talk about more in just a minute. We're actually going to just take a quick 3-minute intermission in case anybody needs to grab a drink or anything. And then we got a lot more to cover when we get back.
T-minus 3 minutes.
Say online, that's some fascist dystopian Orwellian mind. Clown these bureaucratic acrobatics got me spastic and dramatic. They want access to your Spotify, your TikTok automatic. Every habit that you practice, want to catalog and stash it in a database is massive as some VHS tactics. But it's tragic, these fanatics want to track us like we're cattle. Build a dragnet apparatus like the internet's a battle. I'm empowered by encryption, got conviction in my diction. Prophecies about permission, but it's freedom, that's the mission. For a healthy, happy nation, not a brave new world creation where the tracing conversations, placing agents in your basement. Really it's about permission, but they just want our submission. Privacy, protection, freedom, they're the perfect coalition. That's the freedom I define, that's the future, that's the peak. You can freely speak your mind if you're allowed to hide and
T-minus 2 minutes.
design, they can't confine what I define. I'll shine a light and fight until we take back what is mine. That's the freedom I believe, that's the future, that's the peak. You can freely speak your mind when you're allowed to hide and speak.
T-minus 1 minute.
Everybody posting every place that they've been. Trading privacy for likes, that's a heavy cost. In the ocean of data, the person gets lost. So we flip the switch, yeah, we go underground. Moving through the silence without making a sound. Not hiding because you are doing something wrong. Just defending your rights before they are gone. The room is secure, so let the session start. Speak from the brain or speak from the heart. Tell us your story, we unlock the doors. We invite the guests, and yeah, the floor is yours. You can keep the mask on.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Privacy expresses, but opinions are free. We amplify the voices that they try to call weak. Welcome to the stream, time to hide and speak. Hide and speak, stay in the shadows and make some noise. Hide and speak, hide and speak. Digital freedom, yeah, that is our choice. Hide and speak, hide and speak. Privacy
10,
doesn't mean not having
9,
a voice.
8,
Hide and speak,
7,
hide and speak.
6,
What you wanna share
5,
is only your
4,
choice.
3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome back. This is Hide and Speak, and we're here with the absolute legend, Daniel J. Bernstein. So, Daniel, you argue that the IETF may be breaking antitrust law, not just its own rule. Can you walk me through that?
Yeah, antitrust law, it's kind of complicated, but the basic concept is if you rewind to around 1900, then there were some really rich people who were, I mean, it's totally different from now, really rich people who were kind of running the country in the US. And for instance, Rockefeller, I mean, he built up a fortune of like $1 billion, more than $1 billion by the time he died. And he was running these really big companies. So Standard Oil was maybe the most famous of these monopolistic companies that was running these company towns where they were in charge of everything. They had a monopoly over, well, oil, and it was such a big business that they were able to dictate the terms of people's lives. And this is something where, again, try to imagine like really rich people being in charge of everything that you're doing. And it's just at some point, well, the public said, okay, this is just unacceptable. It took a while to get that built up to the point of having some laws. But the antitrust law idea is basically you're not allowed to have monopolies, whether it's a single company that's in charge of everything or a cartel of companies that's dividing things up. You're just not allowed to do that. Now, okay, what exactly does this mean? That's where it gets complicated and you get like 300-page court decisions, which are saying, okay, is Google actually a monopolist? Complicated. All right, yes, they are, but what should be done about it? Probably a slap on the wrist is the right solution. Should we break up the company? Nah, it's too complicated. Or sometimes you have bigger effects, like in the 1980s, American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, they were a big monopoly. And I realized I should try to plug in my tablet. Give me just a second before I. All right, knocking things over while I try to plug this in. Sorry.
Oh, good.
Because I know that this tablet can die in a matter of seconds. All right.
We are used to technical difficulties here. Usually we start the show with our mics muted.
All right. And do I get some light here? Yes. All right. Tablet is not going to die, maybe. All right, where was I? So AT&T in the 1980s, they were broken up into a bunch of tiny little phone companies. And then those phone companies, well, they still kind of worked together with each other, but they were not having as much control as AT&T was, and there was more price competition. At this point, some of the phone companies have bought each other, but there's competition from the internet. So you do see a lot of competition for prices of communication, and we have pretty amazing communication that can happen for a pretty low price at this point. Okay, so antitrust law, sometimes it has more of an effect, sometimes it has less of an effect. But the basic concept is, again, you're not supposed to have monopolies. Now, what does that mean for standards? Well, standards are, if they're good standards, then there's something where people say, okay, look, we don't want to be fighting about power plugs, for example. We just want to all use the same power plug so that everybody can interoperate. Everybody can have the same devices plugging into the same power receptacles, and you get these interchangeable parts. And that's good for everybody if you have a standard. On the other hand, standards can also be used in anti-competitive ways. So you can have standards which are designed to protect a monopoly. You can have, for example, a standard which is excessively complicated so that only one big company can afford to comply with all the rules. Or you can have a standard which is something which is, it's like narrowing the possible range of competition down to something which is worse than what the consumers would get if there were a free market. You might have that, here's a standard saying you should do the following. And then what the consumer actually wants is something better. And there's companies which are willing to do something better, but the standards are being used to say, no, that's not the standard, even though it's better. And so, for example, there was a court case, went up to the Supreme Court in the 1980s. And this was with a company called Hydro Level. And they had a better way to do something about if you have like some water control devices to make sure that, like water boilers, for instance, you don't want them to explode or overheat, that kind of stuff. And so Hydro Level had some better devices for doing this kind of water control stuff. But the dominant companies in that market said, nah, what you're doing is not compliant with the standard, which is, well, set by those companies, and those companies were in charge of a standards organization, and they sent a letter to. It was funny. They actually had a fake request from a company for an interpretation of the standard to say, is this Hydro Level product? Is that something which is actually okay to use? And the corrupt committee chair, who was in charge of this, subcommittee chair, sent back a letter saying, oh, thank you for asking. What a surprise that you asked. Actually, no, their product is definitely not compliant with that standard. You should be using standard products. Now, Hydro Level, I mean, they were maybe convincingly arguing that they had a better product, but how are they going to fight against the standard if they're doing something which is not the standard certified by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers? And okay, so they went to court. They sued the companies that were responsible for this and the standards organization, ASME. And then the Supreme Court said, look, this is clearly anti-competitive behavior, and we're going to do triple damages for this. Hydro Level still went bankrupt, but at least they won the court case. It's like all good in the end. So antitrust law does have something to say about standards, which is you're not supposed to be using standards to interfere with competition. You're not supposed to, I mean, that's the real evil of a monopoly, is dictating people's lives because nobody else can jump in and make people's lives better. And that's the real pernicious impact of monopoly. And standards can be part of that. You can have a cartel of companies which are setting up a fake standards organization in order to approve what they're doing as a standard. Something like if companies get together for price fixing, saying like, oh, we're going to agree on, here's the price for our products, here's the features we're going to provide, then that is per se illegal under antitrust law. But if companies say, oh, we're making a standard, and then within that standard, they're agreeing on what features to provide, and then, well, as long as it doesn't sound like price fixing, then is that compliant with antitrust law? Well, there's actually rules in antitrust law dealing with this. And the rules basically say that you have to have in your standards organization, because these are, even if they're private organizations, they still have this quasi-regulatory effect. These standards organizations must have consensus for standards, and they must have an appeals process so that you can't have like a subcommittee chair just going off and doing something. They have to, everything's going bad. So I'm going to try turning off the camera. I hope that helps. So hopefully you can hear me at this point. Let me see if I can get a thumbs up. Is audio still coming through?
Yep, sounds good now.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry for. Again, antitrust law, there is this part of antitrust law which is governing how standards are supposed to work. And it's setting rules for things like consensus. And most standards organizations are following those rules, but IETF is not, which is really amazing that a standards organization is just, well, it's an example of how powerful Silicon Valley is, that their standardization arm, the IETF, is able to just ignore the law, just like Silicon Valley generally ignores the law.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, like, so the whole consensus thing is really strange to me because, like, you know, the IETF says that they don't vote, yet all these stories seem to involve vote tallies. So, like, you know, how do they actually decide? Who gets to decide the consensus? And, like, you know, I don't really get that. You know, especially when you have these ones that are pretty split down the middle.
Yeah, I mean, there's first of all this ambiguity that consensus, if you look in a dictionary, then depending which dictionary you look at, it might say that consensus means something everybody agrees on, or it might say something that most people agree on. Now, everybody, that's very clear. Most people, well, what exactly does that mean? And then most, you can look up the definition of that. It's like almost everybody, general agreement in a group. Okay, what exactly does this mean? So eventually what happened when this got turned into a law saying how consensus is supposed to work is Congress actually said, all right, we're going to have these rules for standards organizations, and we're actually going to define consensus by reference to OMB document, blah, 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 from 1998. And, well, that document says What you need for consensus is not necessarily unanimity. So you don't need everybody to agree for something to be consensus under the standardization rules in antitrust law. But you do need that every objection is fairly considered and answered. So if something is not resolved as part of a consensus process, you need to have that there's an answer to every objection. What this looks like in most standards organizations, ISO, for example, the International Organization for Standardization, they have these forms that people, it's like a little spreadsheet where when people are filing comments on a document, a proposed standard, then ISO will have this form where you put in each comment as a separate entry in the form. And then the central tracking of these forms requires that there's an answer to each of the comments. And so, I mean, ISO just has this straight up rule and forms that enforce this, saying that committees have to respond to every comment that's received. And that's, I mean, it's basically what the law says, is you have to have every objection has to be fairly considered and has to have a response. If it's not, if the objection is not treated as, yeah, you're right, we'll fix that, then there has to be an answer which is saying, okay, we're not going to fix it, but here's why. And so there has to be that explanation in writing from the group of why some objection is overridden. And there has to be general agreement. And then, okay, what does general mean? Well, that's the law still doesn't pin that down, but it's something where if you look at ISO, for example, they have rules for, beyond responding to every objection, here's numerically what you need for the votes. And so it's very unusual that IETF as a standards organization does not follow these rules in standardization, in the standardization rules in antitrust law. I'm going to try the camera again. Hopefully the internet burp is off here, and maybe this is going to come through, but if it's flaking out again, then I'll turn the camera off again.
Yeah, technology. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, it looks like the people have a lot of questions.
I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to cut the camera. Sorry about this.
You.
Can you hear us okay now?
Okay, it's good that people can hear me, but I think I'm getting video burps and audio burps whenever I have the camera on. So I do hear people now, so I'll shut up for a moment.
Good. You hear us okay then? We hear you fine now. All right, let's try to do some.
I just heard you. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay,
sorry for the technical difficulties.
No issues. It happens. Let's see. It looks like the NSA has co-opted the IETF and is pushing for weak standards. Solo MLDSA and Solo MLChem are being published as RFCs, which implementers use as a compass. What's the NSA's objective?
Okay, yeah. So I got the question of what is NSA trying to do? What's the NSA objective with pushing for, Solo MLDSA, Solo MLChem? So there are a few possibilities, and maybe it's helpful as context to look at the Snowden documents, which have a lot of information about what NSA is doing, which is basically they're trying everything they can think of. And I mean, they have this massive budget. The NSA budget years ago was already more than $10 billion a year. And I mean, they just casually spend a couple billion on building another data center. It's a couple $1 billion on building a data center. It's really massive budget. And with that kind of budget, you can try everything you can think of to attack people. And okay, so what does this mean for post-quantum crypto? Well, there's a few theories for what NSA is trying to accomplish here. One of them is possible, which is that NSA has already figured out how to break these structured lattice systems. MLDSA and MLChem, these are what are called structured lattice systems, which is a particular kind of mathematical construction of post-quantum crypto systems. And these have been gradually losing security over the years. Proposals from some years ago are basically all broken, and people have had to scale them up to resist the attack improvements. And we're not sure how much further the attacks are going to go. There's new improvements all the time. There's improvement. There was an attack paper in December, attack paper in February, and these are improving attacks against these structured lattice systems, sometimes against general lattice systems. And that's kind of scary. Now, okay, the attacks, it's not that any particular paper is dramatically changing the attack picture, the way that what happened for Psych, that was a sudden breakthrough of suddenly something that looked very secure was basically no security. What's happened for lattice systems is much more gradual, that each paper is maybe cutting out a few bits of security. And then is that going to stop at some point? Or is it going to be people realize, whoops, the things that we're doing now are actually, it's really not secure, like using RSA 512 in the 1990s. That is something which 20 years later, academics were breaking that for like $75 of cloud time. It's really low security. And that's something where maybe we'll be looking at today's lattice systems in, say, 10 years and say, oh, how could we possibly have thought that this was big enough? And NSA, if they're just some years ahead of the rest of us in figuring out these attack algorithms, then they could just know a weakness in MLDSA and MLChem, one or the other, or both. They're kind of related, what they're doing internally. There are lots of differences, but there is some overlap, and it's easy to see how one possible attack could possibly break both of those, maybe. Or it could be that NSA is just betting on lots of software bugs that they'll be able to exploit. And this is something where already in the Snowden documents, there was lots of evidence of NSA exploiting software problems for cryptography and more than cryptography. I mean, it's a big problem in computer security that we've got all these software problems, bugs that are very often severe vulnerabilities. And so from NSA's perspective, if that's the best that they can get away with, I mean, maybe they haven't figured out, maybe they're actually confident that MLDSA and MLChem are secure, but they're still going, haha, we can break all the software. At least enough of the software that they can break into millions of connections. And okay, that's a win for them as the attacker. I think the bigger picture of what's going on here is that it's not just MLDSA and MLChem. These are the first things being rolled out at this scale is MLDSA and MLChem. But they're just some kind of early designs of what you can do in structured lattice-based systems. There are already better signature systems from a speed perspective, from like reducing the amount of bandwidth that you're using for, compared to MLDSA. There are other lattice-based signature systems that are like half the size or even smaller. Compared to MLChem, there are encryption systems that are half the size. And that's something where if those are secure, if this whole idea is not something breakable, then, well, in some years we'll be looking at those new systems, and some people will say, oh, yeah, we want to get that extra performance improvement. And so, okay, imagine as an attacker, you're looking at this situation of there's lots of proposals, a lot of them get broken. First ones get standardized, and then, well, maybe they know how to break those, maybe not. But the bigger picture is those are just some of the post-quantum systems that are going to get deployed. And if NSA can normalize doing risky stuff like throwing away seatbelts, then they're going to be able to sometimes break things, just like Psych got rolled out as a high confidence system, deployed on actual user data, tens of millions of connections, and then got totally broken. That's going to happen sometimes. Whether it happens for MLChem and MLDSA, maybe, but it's going to happen for some post-quantum systems. And if we keep doing reckless things, then we are going to sometimes get in a lot of trouble. And so to me, that feels like, again, whether or not I feel like normalizing solo post-quantum crypto is already a win for the attacker. And so to me, that feels like a complete explanation of what they're getting out of doing this.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's a unfortunate thing to be happening for sure.
Video flake out. So I worry that I'm again having even worse internet troubles. But okay, suddenly I get video back. So I'll shut up here.
All right, cool. Why are the security area directors and working group leads of the IETF generally made up of members or former members of the NSA?
That is a great question. Yeah, there are a bunch of NSA people in IETF. And to be clear, it's not always NSA people, but it's almost always defense contractors. So if you look, for example, right now at the security area directors in IETF, there is, for example, Deb Cooley, lifetime NSA employee, then retired and is now one of the security area directors for IETF. The other one is Chris Inaccio. Now, you might, if you look quickly at the affiliation, then you see, oh, Carnegie Mellon University. Well, academic, that doesn't sound so bad. But if you look closer, then you see that Inaccio works for an organization called the Software Engineering Institute. Now, this is what's called an FFRDC. Sorry for all the jargon suddenly, but starting in, I think, the 1950s, the federal government said, you know, we have this problem with federal pay scales that we're not allowed to pay for the best people. For instance, we'd like to hire some really top whatevers, and we just can't afford that on the federal pay scales. So what we can do is hire a consulting company. And let's just make some shell companies called FFRDCs, stands for Federally Funded Research and Development Centers. And those are going to be able to hire at whatever pay scale they want. I mean, it's not part of the federal government. It's like a subsidiary of the federal government. They do what the federal government tells them to do. And well, that is what the Software Engineering Institute is. Even though they're hosted at a university, they're actually owned and operated by the US federal government. They are a defense contractor within a university. There's more examples of this, like Lincoln Labs at MIT. These are FFRDCs. They are actually defense contractors that just happen to be parts of universities, but they are completely under the thumb of the US government. They're entirely funded by the US government, and they do what the US government tells them to do. And so that is the other security area director. And so this sort of corruption happens because you've got, well, people come to IETF and say, I would like to participate in IETF, and anybody can do this, but only the people who keep doing it because they are paid to do it all the time are people who end up being eligible to serve in these management roles inside IETF. And so the room ends up being packed by, well, NSA people and other defense contractors and a lot of Silicon Valley people who are similarly, I mean, Cisco sends 100 people to each IETF meeting. These are, well, whoever can afford to pay for participating in IETF, even though in theory it's free, the reality is it's managed by people who the eligibility requirements say you have to be at a certain level of participation, where the only people who can afford that are people being paid to do this full time. And so NSA pays various people to go to IETF, and similarly, SEI, this FFRDC that I mentioned, they pay people to go to IETF, and well, they end up being selected as security area directors.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like, you know, that's kind of been the scam all along, that like it's open and free to anybody, but like in order to, like you say, have a level of involvement necessary to really make a big impact in like a managerial level, like you either have to be independently wealthy or have somebody funding you to be able to pull that off. So it really narrows it down to a very small percentage of people that could potentially do that. And, you know, when, like you say, defense contracts, that's where the big money is. So that's who has the money to send a lot of people. So yeah, that's definitely a big problem. Let's see, this is a good one here. Why is it dangerous for the IETF to push solo PQ encryption as an RFC?
Yeah, good question. Let me do another try on the camera here, see if this manages to get through. All right, so when IETF is saying, here's an RFC, which is specifying something, then what most readers look at for an RFC is they understand that if they've heard of RFCs and of IETF, then they think, oh, RFCs, that means IETF standards, internet standards. And now that's technically not exactly right, because RFCs can just be informational documents. They might not even be things that IETF has centrally approved. They can be individual documents. But most people looking at RFCs, they don't know this. They just hear, oh, RFC, that means IETF standard. And so suppose IETF puts out an RFC, and you look at the RFC maybe, and it says, oh, this is consensus of the IETF community. And you think, well, okay, that means that maybe you think consensus means unanimous. Maybe you think it's just, you know, basically everybody agreeing. Either way, you think, okay, this is something non-controversial. It's something which is being endorsed by IETF. And so you then look at options for, say, post-quantum encryption. And suppose you see the options are the following. You could do post-quantum crypto with ML count, Kyber. Or you could do post-quantum crypto with MLChem plus elliptic curves, which sounds more complicated, right? And maybe do some performance measurements, and you're like, yeah, it's a little bit more bandwidth, not much, but doing this extra elliptic curve thing, it costs a little bit more. And maybe you look at the documents and you try to figure out, I mean, is there some reason that these are both approved? And well, the documents don't really make these clear. And I mean, the document saying, yeah, we're going to specify, here's how you do MLChem inside TLS. That document, it doesn't say there's anything wrong with it. It says this is a perfectly fine standard, and it's got IETF endorsement. And so even if you're looking at it pretty carefully, this is more than I think most people look at these documents, then you feel like, oh, why don't I use the more efficient one? I mean, even if it's just a little bit more efficient, maybe that helps, and save the environment. It's a little simpler to implement, not much because you already have elliptic curve sitting around, but even just a little bit. Why not? If both of these are approved, why not take the slightly simpler, slightly more efficient one? Even if you can't convince yourself that the difference matters, just it has this advantage of feeling a little bit simpler. And then a lot of people just comparing efficiency, say they just naturally pick the slightly more efficient option. And then there's going to be other people who are saying, oh, actually, I've heard that there's these defense contracts. My company's big enough to maybe compete for some of those. And I've heard that can only do those if I use this. There goes my video again. So I'm going to try knocking off the camera. Sorry about that.
Good.
All right. So the end result of this is quite a few people are going to be saying, yeah, we're going to use this thing just because it's sitting there as an RFC, where then this idea that IETF has endorsed it is not going to be there. And then there's going to be a lot of people where more alarm bells are going to go off, and they're going to say, okay, this is not approved, and there's probably something controversial about it, and maybe I should do what IETF has actually endorsed. And IETF has in fact endorsed doing elliptic curves plus post-quantum encryption. So this is something which roll out post-quantum crypto is to do elliptic curves plus post-quantum crypto. And that's, again, a sensible, normal thing to do. And it's what everybody would be doing except for NSA meddling in this process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, like if they're both proposed and they have a stamp of approval on both, I think a lot of people are going to opt for what is the easiest way to get my project live, and whatever looks simpler at the time is probably what they're going to go with. If it says they're both approved, a lot of people are going to choose that simpler option without a full understanding of what that actually means. Like we're in an age where anybody can just fire up AI and create an app or create a website or create whatever they want with very little understanding of security or anything behind it. So there's going to be a lot of people creating projects that don't know the difference between them. So at best, they're going to look and say, okay, these are approved. Which one's simpler? I'm going to use that one because it's easier, and then we're all using a weaker form of encryption. So it's definitely a risk there. Even if they're both included, just having it there is kind of a big problem. Now there's another issue we got. There's a new proposal called Mod Pod. What would that create?
Oh, Mod Pod is an interesting concept. So in IETF, there are some rules. Even though I was saying that IETF does not do what antitrust law says standards organizations have to do, it doesn't do what most standards organizations do, but it still does have a few rules. And some of those rules are things like anybody can join a mailing list and participate in IETF. Except, there's an exception to that, which says that if people are disrupting the working group process, then the working group chairs can shut that down. And then, there's an appeals process in case of controversy, but that's what the rules have been for quite some time. Now, if you're trying to sabotage a standard, then you can look at something like this and say, aha, I can use this to silence objections. All I have to do is claim that the people who are saying things that I don't like and that are building up more and more opposition to my sabotage document, all I have to do is say that those are disrupting the process. Or maybe even don't say it's disrupting the working group process, say it's disruptive behavior. And so just disconnect it from any concept of the process that's supposed to be happening, just declare that things are disruptive. And so this is something that's been happening more and more recently, that the IETF management is declaring more and more examples of behavior to be disruptive, never mind whether it's actually disrupting anything. I mean, they might think, oh, this is disrupting the natural progress of this document that we're trying to sabotage. But I mean, it's not actually disrupting the working group process. If people are filing objections, it's a mandatory part of the IETF process to be having disagreements resolved through open review and discussion. And the place for that to happen is IETF working group mailing lists. And so the people who are trying to censor this, those are people who are disrupting the process. And when they issue accusations of, oh, you're doing disruptive behavior, then, well, the end result of that is that dissent gets censored, the opposition gets censored, and the corrupt part gets through. Now, the people who are ignoring objections, trying to silence objections, have a long-standing pattern of doing the following, which is something, I mean, everybody who's participated in these processes recognizes the following pattern. There's an objection that's raised, and maybe it's a very simple thing to deal with. It gets dealt with, fine. There's maybe some little technical discussions of things, fine. But maybe there's a bigger objection, something which is really fundamental, and that objection gets ignored. Example of this would be something like, oh, come on, throwing away our existing protections, which are really cheap on top of this post-quantum crypto. Why are we doing that? That's really stupid. That's an example. I mean, you shouldn't say words like stupid. You should say this is damaging security. But the point is, this is an objection which is really fundamental to these documents which are throwing away the existing elliptic curve encryption. And those kinds of fundamental objections, well, they get ignored. The people who are trying to push documents through, they respond to the little easy stuff and they ignore the big stuff. And so then what happens to these objections? Well, again, IETF does not have tracking of the objections. IETF there's nothing forcing a response to objections. And so the people who are objecting, maybe a month later say, come on, I've got this fundamental objection. What are you doing continuing to work on this document without addressing this really fundamental objection? And then it gets ignored again. And then a month later, maybe the same thing happens. And then somebody else says, you're repeating yourself. You've been raising this objection again and again. And then the answer to that is, but that's because it hasn't been answered and it's a really fundamental objection. And so this pattern of an objection being raised and ignored and raised and ignored and raised and ignored, Mod Pod, the point of Mod Pod is to say that if you're repeating an objection, that is disruptive behavior that can be censored, which to me is crazy. This is totally backwards from how a standards organization should be working. What other standards organizations do, if there's an objection, it gets addressed, and it has to be addressed by the rules. In IETF, objections get ignored, and if they get repeated, then, well, the point of Mod Pod is censoring that. And so those rules are basically in place now, that people who are repeating can get thrown out of IETF for repeating the objections. There can even be a lifetime ban for repeating objections in IETF, even if the objections have never been addressed.
It's insane. I mean, don't they even have one for incessive requests for evidence? So just asking for evidence of something is apparently considered harassment now? That's insane.
Yeah, exactly. It's right. It doesn't have to be a fully formed objection, because sometimes people are just making claims where they say this document is justified because of blah. And you say, wait, where's your evidence for blah? And they ignore that because they don't actually have evidence. And then a month later you say, does anybody actually have evidence for blah? That's supposed to be the motivation for this. And nobody has evidence. And I mean, maybe people try making things up and you say, come on, do you have any actual pointers that I can verify this claim? And at that point already 4 times you've been questioning that there's evidence supporting this document, and that is clearly disruptive behavior. This is just crazy. The standards organization has a responsibility to the public, and that responsibility includes making sure that objections are addressed and making sure that you're putting together a standard that serves the public interest, like power plugs. It should not be a standard that is being rammed through non-consensually and ignoring objections, which is how things work in IETF.
You actually got a pretty ominous warning during this fight at one point. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, I have to admit there's a few different ominous warnings, so I'm having trouble figuring out which one you're referring to.
Okay, this was one that came along with a threat for now this is your right. That one I thought was
yeah, that was a good
chilling.
one. So that was, that was saying, I'd filed an objection to something, and then there was one of the IETF security area directors was trying to shut that down, trying to dodge it. And I mean, there is this appeals procedure where you should be able to file an appeal and say, come on, something has gone seriously wrong here, let's fix this. But he was, instead of dealing with the appeal properly, he was saying, I don't want to deal with this. And so I was complaining there was a supposedly consensual decision, which was nowhere near consensual. And I was saying, come on, there was this fake declaration of consensus. I think I avoided using the word fake at that point. And I went through, here's what actually happened, and why was there this claim of consensus when there wasn't, in fact, consensus? And that's a really uncomfortable question for people who are issuing fake declarations of consensus. And so, of course, the people in charge try to dodge this kind of question. And one of the dodges was saying, oh, there's clearly consensus. There were 60-something, like the vast majority of the 60-something responses were in favor, a few opposed. And I said, no, here's the actual numbers, which were nowhere near what you're saying in favor, and quite a few more opposed. And here's the evidence of that. And then there were more dodges. And then at some point, I said, look, here's these rules that say you have to be addressing this appeal. And that's where that warning came of saying, you are such a pest, and go away. Well, okay, for now you have the right to appeal this, and so okay, I guess I'll pretend to address this. And it was, especially the for now wording was more than a little bit uncomfortable there. I mean, this is really not how standards organizations should work.
Yeah, it was just a very chilling when I read about that. I mean, it's just a very clear threat there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's wild. So you connect weakening crypto and silencing dissent. Why are those the same story for you?
You know, a lot of the effect of surveillance is to enforce power. So you've got, I mean, there can be reasons that sound good for doing surveillance, but the major effect of it is the people in charge want to maintain and extend their power. And one of the ways that they can do that is, well, figuring out what everybody else is doing. And the more they know about what's going on, the better chance they have to, well, shut down threats to their power. And so, okay, what's the opposition to this? It is dissent. And if you look at famous court cases in the US, for example, there was a court case between the NAACP and the US government. Actually, I take that back. I think it was actually a state government. And maybe it was Virginia. And what the state was doing was trying to get the membership rules of this organization. And NAACP said, no, we don't want to provide the membership rules. And this turned into a big court battle of, is the government allowed to find out who's the members of NAACP or even a local chapter of NAACP? And what does this do to trying to organize if you have the government watching everything you're doing? It can be really chilling for people who are trying to improve the situation, trying to improve governance, trying to organize movements which will democratically improve what's going on. If you have these organizations being monitored by the government, then look at what happened with East Germany under the Stasi. The Stasi were able to suppress dissent for many years by monitoring what everybody was doing, what everybody was thinking. Eventually it broke down, but it was a very effective system. And that's something where authoritarians around the world look at that as a model and say, ooh, now with computers and the internet, how can we monitor even more? And so power versus dissent. That historically is the big thing happening here, where surveillance is part of how power is trying to figure out what dissent is doing. What's happening in IETF is just a tiny reflection of that, where people who are saying, come on, we want to protect ourselves against the attackers, whoever the attackers are, whether it's NSA, the Chinese government, the Russian government, or anybody else. We would like to have our communication secure. We want some privacy. We don't want to have people watching over our shoulders. And if there's some mechanism where the people in power are trying to extend that power by watching what we're doing, we don't want that. And so that is naturally the dissent, which, as I was saying before, I feel when I say dissent, it might sound like it's a minority. But again, I feel like in a democratic world, this would be 8 billion people in dissent against
totally.
what the people in charge are doing. And so this is really, that's the connection that I see.
Yeah, there's a story that I've told before on this, but I'll say it again because I think it's so important. Like there's this concept that is trying to push on us that if you want privacy, that like there's something wrong with you, you're in the minority, and you're, you shouldn't need to hide if you're not doing anything wrong. But there's when the phone first became like a common thing in people's houses in the 1920s. Within a few years, a product came out called the Hush-a-phone that you could install on your phone that would make it so you could have a private conversation and that no one else in the room could hear what you were saying on the phone. So it was like as soon as this form of electronic communication existed, immediately people started coming up with privacy devices or coming up for ways to do that privately, because everybody wants privacy. That's just a natural human thing. People have certain parts of their life they don't want to share with people, and there's nothing wrong with that. So it's just, I think it's so important to constantly keep telling people, like, it's not weird that you want to have privacy. Like, it's totally a normal thing. And like, you're right. If everybody was really being honest, it would be at least 8 billion people dissenting here and saying, none, we're not okay with this. Like, we want to have our privacy. So there's a lot more of us than you think.
Right. And it's not that, I might not have anything to hide, but I also have things that I don't want stolen. And I think, Shannon Morse that was on a few weeks ago said that really well. It's like, yeah, I might not necessarily need to hide these things, but I don't want you to know my bank account password or, where my children go to school or things like this. It's not that I'm trying to hide these things, but I also don't want, it to be accessed by anyone.
Sure. Well, let's see. We got some more great questions here. Can Daniel discuss what he's observed from NIST trying to bury the hash-based algorithms like Winternets and Sphinx? Thanks, and DJB, absolute legend.
Thanks for the question. You guys are embarrassing me here. I think, okay, so what happened in the NIST competition was NIST said from the outset that the most important goal is security. And now, look, sometimes there can be tension between security and performance. There are times when sometimes the things that we want to do for security are maybe too expensive, or we're not sure they might be too expensive. And so, there can be a problem there. But if your priority is security, then the way you handle that is you say, look, let's do the thing that's secure. And then if that's a performance problem and we have to start making compromises, then let's figure out what we can manage to afford. But we're prioritizing security. Security is the default thing to do. And so, you would think after NIST said their priority is security, then they would take the most secure submissions to their competition. And now from the beginning, they said that they didn't just want to pick one winner. They wanted to have several acceptable possibilities. So the sensible thing to do would be for them to say, all right, let's take the most secure, most confidence-inspiring submissions. And let's say those are the default things to do, but just in case you need something which is faster or smaller, then here is something else. And so then they could have maybe 3 choices for this, 3 choices for that. And here's a spectrum of possibilities where the default thing is, in the case of signatures, the most conservative signature system is Sphinx Plus. Now, this is something where NIST actually did standardize Sphinx Plus. And so you would think, well, okay, so obviously they said, since the priority is security, they're standardizing Sphinx Plus, and they're telling everybody use Sphinx Plus, unless if you have if you need something more secure, more efficient, because Sphinx Plus is maybe too big, like at the high security levels, we're talking, it could be 50 kilobytes for a signature. And maybe for some applications, that's too much. And so, okay, here's something which is smaller, only like the 2,420 bytes that I mentioned before. And that's if you need it, then you can use that instead. What NIST actually did was backwards from that, because even though they paid lip service to security and they said their top priority was security, what they actually did was they said, okay, by default, you should be using the new fancy mutating, hopefully we got it right now, ignore the bugs that we've seen so far, MLDSA. And if you need something which is more secure, then you should use Sphinx Plus. Which, okay, is better than saying, oh, they're just going to take the fast thing as their only standard, which is what they did for encryption. But it's still backwards. What we should be doing is saying, look, there are a ton of applications where the cryptography is not a bottleneck. There are a ton of things where you're signing like a megabyte download, and it doesn't matter if you have 50 kilobytes for a signature on that. And so let's, for the cases where you can just easily afford the secure thing, let's use the secure thing. And, well, Sphinx Plus, that is the conservative thing. And that's, I mean, there's still, unfortunately, NIST was requiring different choices of security levels instead of just saying, look, take the biggest thing. And then, I mean, Sphinx Plus offers, you could go for 128-bit security, 256-bit security. There's a few choices to make there. And I recommend going for the largest size there. But NIST, they didn't even get to that point. They just said, oh, you should use dilithium, MLDSA, as the default thing. And to me, that's just crazy.
Thank you for that. That was a great explanation. We'll get another important one here. Let's see. When you fought the U.S. government to earn the U.S. and the world encryption as free speech, what kind of risks and even deliberate attacks were you subjected to?
Oh, man. There was actually a movie made about this. It's called Mission Impossible. No, it was actually, it was fine. So look, the thing to appreciate about all of these encryption battles is that it's not actually like everybody wants to spy on everybody else. It's really much more like there's this tiny group of people in power that want to spy on everybody else. And that's actually, it's so unpopular that even within the US government, the situation in the 90s was NSA and a few other supporters of NSA were really isolated within the US government. They were fighting, for example, against the Department of Commerce regarding what to do for encryption. And it wasn't just the Department of Commerce. Lots of parts of the US government were recognizing the advantages of having cryptography protecting everybody. Instead of saying, oh, we're going to try to spy on everybody and introduce weaknesses, look at Salt Typhoon. This is a recent example of if you set up weaknesses for NSA to use or for the government to use generally, then those are going to be exploited by other attackers. And it's really hard to make something secure. So introducing weaknesses into that to allow surveillance, making things weak enough for NSA to break, is just a really bad idea for everybody else. And then the end result of that was, okay, NSA certainly fought their court battles. There were people who were being harassed, like Phil Zimmerman. Somebody exported PGP. This was software for doing cryptography in the 90s, which Phil Zimmerman wrote. Somebody, not him, exported this outside the US. And then he was getting harassed at the border whenever he was doing international travel. He was getting harassed and he was being threatened with prosecution for somebody having exported PGP outside the country. And which again, at that point, there were export laws about cryptographic software. And that's something where I think it was, I mean, I wasn't threatened with prosecution. I didn't do anything. And it's clear I hadn't done anything. I was more on the attack in court of like, NSA has this infringement to my freedom of speech and I'm going after them. And I don't know what they would have tried going after me for if they'd been creative about it. I just, try to live a legal life and not do anything that I could get busted for. And so, I mean, I never found myself seriously worried like, oh, there's going to be this, spy movie kind of thing where NSA is going to come after me, where other people were. So again, thinking about like Phil Zimmerman's case, I mean, he really was facing stress because of being harassed by the government for something he didn't even do. It was just the government retaliating for the fact that this good cryptographic software, at least good for the time, it was quite a step up from things that were there before. It wasn't like post-quantum or anything, but it had a lot of nice features, and the government was retaliating against him for doing something which was not what NSA wanted. And that, I mean, there are a lot of people who really suffer from that sort of thing. I didn't encounter that. I certainly hearing about the scary incidents that other people encountered, I was a little bit worried, but never seriously worried for myself. And so it was really much more about, look, here's the situation I'm in. I'd like to publish this thing, and let me ask the court for permission to do that under the First Amendment, as opposed to just going ahead and publishing and then saying, okay, that's okay, right? Like the Twinkie defense, I murdered somebody, then I go to court saying a Twinkie's made me do it. And then, well, if the court disagrees, then you're in trouble. For me, it was asking the court for a declaration saying, I really would like to publish this. I haven't done it, but with court permission, I will do it. Now, can I please have permission to do that under the First Amendment? And so that's very different from the situation that some other people were in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Asking permission first is a whole different thing than throwing yourself in the lion's den, having already done it, and then trying to prove that it was okay after the fact is a lot harder. Let's see. What keeps you in this fight?
Well, I'm funded by the Russian government to try to interfere with what the U.S. government wants to do. And damn it, you caught me. How could I possibly have let that out? Oh, no. Look, for me, it's something where I've, for many, many years, really been driven by looking at examples like what the FBI did to Martin Luther King Jr., and other examples of just really suppressing dissent against the government and saying, this is just horrifying. And if I can do even a little bit to help improve democracy and really make it possible for people to organize and make it possible for people to talk to each other privately and say, okay, look, how can we build a movement here and try to improve things? And I think it does naturally happen that over enough years, things do get better, even if there's setbacks every now and then. I do feel like things generally over enough centuries at least do get better, but it's a tough process, and it really can be held back by things that I can maybe do something about, like surveillance. And so I try. That's what motivates me. That's what drives me, is these examples of just absolutely horrifying things that within the things that I know something about, like surveillance things, maybe sometimes encryption can actually help with that. And it's only one piece of a big puzzle, but that's what motivates me.
I love it. It makes sense. What is the one thing you most want people to remember from this conversation?
Well, I can't resist putting in another plug for this little web page that I just put up, the action.cr.yp.to. So again, this is something which, thanks for posting the URL there. This is something which it really, look, the last vote on this, NSA lost. They had a minority, not by much, but they had a minority, and now they're pulling out more people to vote for their document. But, there's two sides to this, and I feel like the majority is against what, majority of people out there are against what NSA is doing. Majority of people do not want surveillance, do not want security weakened. And this is something we can do something about. It's just a question of raising awareness, getting out the vote, like they say. And if NSA is going to pack the vote with more people, then come on, let's get representatives of the general public who care about protecting the public doing something to put a stop to this.
Absolutely. Everybody check out that website. Like, this is the call to action. This is when we need your help. Everybody got to go check that out, find out how to get involved, because if we don't make it known right now that we want to be protected, then we're going to lose the fight, because NSA's got billions of dollars to pay people to go there. So we don't have billions of dollars to pay for you, but we do have a better future for you if you do go vote. So let's all do that.
And that's one thing that we try to harp on this show all the time, right? We try to say one person can make a difference. We try to fight against that mindset of, oh, I'm just one person. What does my vote count? I don't need to go to my local city council meeting or whatever. But no, and DJB is a perfect example here that one person can make a huge difference, just like all of our other guests on this show. And that's really something that people need to know.
Absolutely. So after everything, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the next decade of encryption?
That is a really tough question. I got to say pessimistic. I don't mean to end on a down note here, but so I hope you have some other question. But there's quantum computers look to me like they're coming. And again, I hope they fail. But when quantum computers are here, then there are going to be thousands of high value keys that get broken every year and gradually increasing. And the damage, there are some keys that are in charge of so much, the damage is going to be incredible. We have lots of other problems as well, but having quantum computers coming and really not having done enough to prepare for it, it's really worrisome for me. I do look long term. I think things are going to be better, but short term, it's a real nightmare out there. And the things that we can do to try to improve the situation, well, it's hard to fight against the technology changing, and quantum computers are an example of that. Just like having mass surveillance is really improved by technology, and it's really tough to fight against that. Well, quantum computers are another example of a tool for at least some surveillance to the extent that keys get broken. There are some things which are getting better in encryption. Things like formal verification is getting a lot cheaper, and that is something which has been applied to some cryptographic software and is getting to the point of pretty convincingly getting rid of bugs in some software, which is, it's a really amazing thing to be able to look at some software and say, I am actually confident that this piece of software is bug-free. And it's still a while to get that scaled up to all the software that we're using, or even big chunks of it. But some of it has happened. And to me, that's really inspirational, seeing examples of that. So things slowly get better in some ways. But if you just look the next, say, 5 years, 10 years, then I'm really worried about what quantum computers are doing.
Very good. Very good. So I honestly, I got to take a little bit more optimistic approach, because I talk to people like you and on a regular basis, and I see the people that we have on our side that are fighting for us, and I see the kind of change that a single person can make. And the fact of the matter is, like, a very small percentage of the population is actively fighting back against the surveillance state. A lot of people, the furthest they go is maybe an angry tweet, and that's about it. But there are simple things that we can do. And we have the numbers. Like I said, everybody, like the general public, we're all against surveillance. So if we all come together and make meaningful actions and put our efforts into the right directions, then we can actually make a huge difference. For example, this vote right here that we're talking about, the IETF situation, there's over 70 people watching this right now. If every single person watching this right now joined the IETF list and made it known that they're in favor of the double encryption, what would that do?
I think that's something where, let me just give the camera one more try here. It would be very clear that, the camera doesn't seem to be coming on. Well, oh well. If people show up, all right, hopefully it holds up. If 70 people are showing up on that mailing list and saying, look, the proposal to use solo post-quantum crypto, this is just, we do not support that, then that's something which will make it very, very difficult for the people in charge to claim that there's consensus. And again, standards organizations are not supposed to be just majority vote, like whatever the majority of voters wants is going to be, that's enough to standardize something. It's supposed to be consensus. IETF labels their documents as consensus of the IETF community. And they say that everybody can participate. And again, we've had like this NSA employee showing up for the first time ever on the TLS working group mailing list just to cast a positive vote for solo post-quantum crypto, which NSA is also paying for other people to vote for. It's not just them allowed to do this. It's something where if we get a bunch and saying, let's all say, we don't like this. We don't like surveillance. We don't like weakening of security. And more to the point, we don't want this weakened document. Then that's something which will force even a corrupt chair, even a lifelong NSA employee or a current defense contractor employee who's running the show. It will force them to say, oof, I don't think I can declare this to be consensus or even rough consensus, whatever that means. It's registering a protest. And look, there are times when people come together to register a vote on something and they're hoping that that's going to be, you know, they win the vote. And sometimes it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you end up in the minority. But you still manage to say something through that vote. You still manage to say, look, I don't approve of this. And there's a bunch of us who don't approve of this. And it's making a statement which is sitting there on the record, and it means something. Even if it doesn't win now, it's something which other people can look at and say, yeah, there are other people who care. And that's important. In this case, again, NSA lost the previous vote. They're calling up a bunch of people to get out the vote on their side. So I think that as the public, we can call a bunch of people to get out the vote on the side of the public interest. And that's what should happen now. And I'm optimistic that this is going to carry the day. And we'll see what happens. In any case, I've just today filed my own opposition statement, which was longer than just one line. Some other people have filed statements just one line. The chairs of the group said, oh, things have been discussed already, just say whether you support or not. So it's just fine to send in one line saying, oh, yes, I love NSA, please standardize this, or no, please, I'm in opposition to this, or even just saying, I don't think this has been discussed enough, so please do not standardize it at this time. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to file. And that's something where right now the votes that have happened are just a small group of people who are aware that this is going on, which is primarily NSA and defense contractors, and then some other people have heard about this, and enough that NSA lost the previous vote. But, well, okay, we're going to have to get more awareness. We're going to have to get more people who are realizing what's going on. Again, I have this little page, action.co.yp.to, and it includes links. I have a chart which is saying, one of the links is to a chart of the debate, which is saying, originally they were just very clear, NSA wants this, so we'll standardize it. And then opposition started building up, and then they started faking some technical rationales for it. Like, oh, it's really important to throw away the old elliptic curve stuff because high frequency trading. Yeah, that's it. High frequency trading needs really fast connections, and they're not going to be able to afford to use post-quantum crypto if they're still using elliptic curves. This is all complete nonsense, because high frequency trading, they're going to set up the session before the trading day starts, and then they're going to be switching over to some really fast, what's called symmetric crypto, which has nothing to do, it's not changing with the current proposals. It's something where it's not affected by this switch to post-quantum public key encryption. So it's really just totally bogus argument. But anyway, that sort of fake argument got posted after people realized, oh, there's a lot of opposition to this. And anyway, I've got a link on this action page, got a link which is lets you look at the debate, lets you look at, I've tried to chart, here's the pros and cons that are being claimed, and links to the original statements if you want to look at those, so you can catch up on here's what the debate is saying, and then decide for yourself how you feel about this, and then express yourself. Join the IETF TLS working group mailing list and just reply. It's still okay until, I think it was, they said it ends on the 8th, stops on the 8th of July. I'm not sure if that means it'll still be okay on the 8th. So I would say by the 7th, if you have something to say about this, then that's the moment to file something. And then we'll see what happens.
Yep, you guys hear it there. Make sure you check out that website. Like, we got a few days left. We can go out there and make your voice known. Like, this is the chance to actually, we can actually make a difference. Like I said, if everybody here voted, if everybody goes there and sends them, joins the list, sends their message, lets them know, they have to pay attention to that. The votes, we're talking like 20 to 20. Some of these votes are pretty small numbers. If 70 people suddenly show up, all joining our side, they just can't ignore that. Like I say, we may not win, but at the very least, we make it known that we don't support that, and that's something important. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us on Hide and Speak, and always for fighting for us and a more secure internet. Where should people look for you online besides that page?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I tend to post things every, I don't know, a few times a week. I'll have something to say, maybe sometimes a little more frequently, but which I cross-post between, I have a little microblog, but I cross-post between Mastodon and Twitter. And I mean, I know people have different preferences in which social media, like which sites to use, but so I try to cross-post things. And then I also have a blog where occasionally I'll have a new blog post. And I would say the microblog, so my Twitter or Mastodon accounts, those are main places where I try to announce things that I find interesting. And so if you're on Mastodon, then look for me as djb@cr.yp.to. On Twitter, it's Hashbreaker on twitter.com or whatever Twitter is called these days, x.com. I haven't managed to join Blue Sky yet. A little uncomfortable with their terms and conditions. And I'm also not on W, which is the European version of X, where they've also got some pretty weird terms and conditions. But I am on Mastodon. I am on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thanks again. This has been absolutely amazing. And thank you to everybody here who participated in the live chat and all the great questions we got.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much, DJB. I mean, an absolute masterclass. I hope we can have you back on again sometime in the future.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. It's been an honor for sure. Yeah, again, everybody, thank you for watching this. Share this with people because this is so important. The more people we get involved and the more people that join that list and make our voice known, the more likely we are to have a more secure future for us. So for years, DJB has been out here largely alone fighting for us. It's time we join his side, and he needs backup. So that's what we're here for. Let's get it done, and let's make our voice heard. That's our show for this week. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Chris Miller. This was Hide and Speak. And remember, trust nothing, verify everything, and always stay encrypted.
Hide and speak.
vp.net, the only VPN that can't spy on you. Your browsing data says more about you than you think. From marketing companies to hackers, everyone wants it because it's worth everything. And they'll stop at nothing to spy on you. Your searches and the sites you visit, that's enough to paint a picture. Most VPNs claim to protect your privacy, but here's the problem. You can't actually verify what they're doing behind the scenes. That's where vp.net is different. We're the only VPN built with Intel's SGX technology, the same trusted security used in banking, healthcare, and even the automotive industry. Here's the key. vp.net runs inside a secure black box, a protected environment so locked down that even we can't see inside it. That means no one, not even vp.net itself, can spy on your activity when you connect. You can verify in real time that your VPN is doing exactly what it promises, protecting you and nothing else. vp.net means no hidden tracking, no broken promises, just real provable privacy. vp.net, the only VPN you don't have to trust, because you can verify.
Hide and speak. We stay in the shadows.